Hey guys, it's October 29th, 2024, exactly 1 week before America's next president is elected. Whether Trump wins or Harris wins, a lot of you are going to be either real happy or real upset. And, for a lot of you, the country's going to end now. And for some of you, the country is just going to be saved. Everyone has their own opinions. I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. I'm just telling you about an issue that I see that neither side will fix. I want to bring awareness because I feel like this issue is not talked about enough. And we're seeing a lot of moves in the market that kind of prove what I'm going to say, yet nobody is pointing them out. And we're seeing the market take certain directions with, the price of gold, the price of gold stocks, the price of bonds. If you follow the way they're going, there's starting to be some moves towards this whole de-dollarization thing, but there's also a lack of movement in the investment community, where you see gold stocks aren't following as much as gold is skyrocketing, which this means central banks are buying, but investors aren't catching on. Well, that's not my main topic for today. That's just some things I've seen. But what I do want to talk to you guys about today in this video is that the United States it's found itself on a precarious path, teetering on the brink of financial disaster. And this is due to a combination of reckless fiscal and monetary policy. What does this mean? What's fiscal policy? I know some of you guys know, but I want to make sure everyone's on page. Fiscal policy is spending policy. This is policy that is influenced by Congress, the president. It's when the Treasury funds certain things. It's the budgeting. It's what are we spending on and how are we collecting taxes and how much taxes we're collecting. Now, monetary policy, this is influenced by the Fed. They influence monetary policy through printing money, through buying up government debt, buying mortgage-backed securities. This is called open market operations. And when they increase their balance sheet with all these assets, that's called QE, quantitative easing. They're easing the economy. They're lowering interest rates, and the way that they do this is through inflationary measures by printing more money and monetizing government debt. And when it's the other way around, it's quantitative tightening. It's whenever they try to shrink the balance sheet, and what this does is it makes it harder to monetize the government debt, and it makes it a little bit harder for the economy to thrive when interest rates are lower. Okay, now it's a lot to get into. Just know that this is a debt-based economy, that we're thriving because of cheap money and cheap credit, and that when you take that away, it's hard for our economy to look good. As we navigate through a landscape marred by deficits exceeding $2 trillion twice in just the past 5 years, and keep in mind, it took us 221 years for the country to get to its first $2 trillion. Now we're doing that. Now that's something casual. Where right now we're having an annualized rate. If you look at the past 2 months of how much our debt has gone up, and you annualize that, it's at $4 trillion a year. And it took us 221 years to get to the first 2 trillion, which is just half of that amount. So if you compare to how the debt has gone up historically, we're in a very some would say, like a not good spot. And the consequences of such financial mismanagement is becoming increasingly evident. With national debt spiraling and interest payments consuming record levels of resources, the urgency to address these issues is paramount. As both Republicans and Democrats continue to engage in partisan battles over spending priorities, they're both overlooking the fundamental arithmetic of fiscal responsibility. Spending must ultimately be less than revenue. Without a concerted effort to confront this basic economic truth, the nation faces an inevitable crisis that could have far-reaching implications for its economy and citizens. This country is already headed towards disaster because of all these irresponsible policies, not only caused by both Republicans and Democrats, but it is allowed to happen and even encouraged by the Federal Reserve. So everyone has a part to play in the conditions that we're seeing. And as the years go by, we see a continuous trend of increasing budget deficits. It is now normal to have a budget deficit of $1 trillion in any given year, sometimes even hitting 2 or 3 trillion. And right now we have an annualized rate of 4 trillion. It's been 23 years since we've even seen a budget surplus, and it doesn't look like we're getting one anytime soon. No, forget it. We're at a point where our debt is no longer possible to start being paid off. Each year it's going to go up. We're not going to pay off any of it. It's just getting worse unless we have some dramatic spending cuts and an increase in revenue. But those are both very unpopular policies that, especially right now, given the economic conditions, people do not want any of that. They're not interested in that. People, what they want right now is for the government to come in and save the day. Not knowing that when the government does this, it's making all these problems worse. And it was the cause of all these problems that we're seeing in the first place. You guys hear me? So yeah, we're not in a good spot. We're basically, everyone has that uncle that's loaded up with debt and it's going nowhere in life. This is us as a country. We have so much in debt and we don't know what to do with it. And the interest payments on this debt has been rising steadily over the year from $415 billion in 2013 to $663 billion in 2023. This amounts to a total gain of 60% over these 10 years. That's a big gain. Okay? It really is. Our interest payments should be getting smaller, but instead they're getting bigger. And these 10 years, they went up 60%. Now, the real question is, how much has this payment of interest, how much has our interest payments increased this year alone in 2024? The year's not over yet. We still have a couple months left. How much has it increased? Well, this year alone, it's gone up 51%. It's almost at $1 trillion. I might be at $1 trillion at this point. Last time I checked, it was a while ago. But that's a pretty impressive amount of growth right there. I say if this was your retirement portfolio, you'd be celebrating. You'd be throwing a party. Wow, we're getting rich. But this is not that. Don't get too excited. This is actually our interest on our debt. So this is not something you should party about. To put this into perspective, let's take a look at our military spending. How much does the U.S. spend on the military each year? Lately, it's been a little over $900 billion. This is a crazy amount. We actually spend more. If you were to rank all the countries in the world and you put the ones with the highest military budget at the top, the U.S. is on top. But not only is it on top, it's on top by a drastic, incredible, astronomical amount. Because if you were to combine the budgets of the next 10 countries, this would amount, converted into dollars, to about $700 billion. So the U.S. is spending a significant amount more on their military than the next 10 countries combined. That's a lot of military spending. I wish that was my salary. I'd be having such a good life. But for now, it's a little bit lower. And soon our interest payments are actually they're gonna surpass that of how much we spend on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which these are our highest bills for the government. We spend $1.5 trillion on Social Security, and then on Medicare and Medicaid we spend $1.8 trillion. And our total spending each year is about $6 trillion. So all these are a big, giant chunk of the spending. And they're all going up, interest is going up, and spending's always going up. So it's reaching crazy levels, unsustainable. We have that $4 trillion annualized gain. In the past 2 months, we actually added $677 billion. $677 billion. That's not too far from $1 trillion in the past 2 months. And I predict that interest within the next 5 years, it's going to be the biggest bill on our budget. Because this year, it went up 51%. Let's say you do that again next year, that's putting it at $1.5 trillion, up there with Social Security. Do that again, it's going to be the highest ticket item. So I'd say definitely 5 years, easily. In 5 years, easily, it's going to be the most expensive thing on our budget. And at that point, it's going to be, if we're not already at game over, that's game over. I think we're already at game over, but that's, you can always be at more game over. We currently have a debt to GDP ratio of 124%. This means that our debt is 24% greater than our GDP. What is our GDP? It's the total value of all our goods and services provided in the economy over the course of 1 year. Income, everything, all finished goods, all added up. Our debt is 24 times. No, sorry, not 24 times. 24% more expensive than that. That gives you an idea of how unrealistic it is to pay this thing off. And there's only been one time where this percentage has been higher than this, and that was during COVID, when we had the $5 trillion in stimulus spending, and we had the whole shutdown of the economy, and our debt to GDP ratio reached pretty unsustainable levels. But right now, we don't have any of that. We don't have a government shutdown. We don't have all this COVID spending. So what's up with that? How are we still at 124%? And I want y'all to think about this. During the whole length of World War II and the Great Depression, our debt to GDP ratio, the highest it reached during that time, it was 119%. Right now we're at 124%. Huh? And we're not in a World War II or a World War III. We're not in the Great Depression. I do believe we are in a recession, but the government and the media, they do their best to hide it. But us people, us middle class, everyone feels it. Everyone feels it. Bills are harder to pay. We're at record low savings, record high debt, record foreclosures. We have the housing market doing its worst in the past couple of years. We have all these layoffs, these bank branches shutting down, all these fast food locations shutting down. No, we're in a recession. They're just good at making people think we're not. Now, Republicans can say that it's the fault of the Democrats, and the Democrats can say it's the fault of the Republicans. They're both going to blame each other, but that's not anything productive because they both have played a large part in this. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but look, I'm trying to reach a solution. I think it's time for us to put aside the identity politics, put aside the two-party politics. This is what George Washington warned us about. He warned against political parties because of times like we have today, where people are so divided and we can't even be friends, where we hate each other just because we're on different sides of things. And we very much disagree on a lot of issues. Now, both parties have a lot of guilt in this. You could say your party is the party that's fixing things and the other one's destroying things. But I'm going to hit y'all with the list of both Democrat presidents and both Republican presidents. A list of presidents who have done tremendous damage to our economy, who have increased our debt by substantial amounts, increased our spending, lowered interest rates too low, and have completely messed with the economy. And we're going to start off today with one of the best presidents we've ever had in terms of damaging the economy. As good old Richard Nixon. Yes, I know I started with the Republican, but don't worry, we're gonna get to some Democrats too, okay? Today, everyone's receiving a little bit of criticism, all right? And it's always good to be able to take it, because if you can't take criticism, then you're not gonna grow as a person, okay? So no one's perfect. These people have also done really good things. I don't want anyone to be angry. I just want you to hear me out because I spent a good amount of time on researching this, and because I want you people, I want everyone to be well informed on what's going on. So Richard Nixon, what is one crazy thing that Richard Nixon did? Well, in 1971, he took us off the gold standard. Now, for a little bit of context, we used to be on a gold standard. What does that mean? What does it mean to be on a gold standard? Well, gold used to be the main form of money. You know how we see the dollar today? That's how back then people saw gold. You know, money was gold. Today, money is the dollar or whatever currency you're using. It was very different. And paper currency existed as a claim to that gold. It was kind of like when you write a check. When you have a check, it's a claim to money. It's a claim to dollars in the bank. Back then, your paper currency was a claim to gold in the bank. That's what it was. That's what paper currency was. But the main form of money was gold. And actually, the original dollar was not a paper or not a piece of paper. The original dollar was a silver coin. Our US dollar was actually based off the Spanish dollar, which was a pure silver coin. They also called it the Spanish piece of 8, and it was 20 something grams of silver, pure silver. And so what we did when we created our own currency, we based our dollar off of the Spanish dollar. And so it was a coin, a silver coin. And then aside from the dollar, we also had half dollars and we had quarter dollars, which this is where we get quarters from. It was just a silver coin. It was a silver dollar, but just smaller. And so that it was 1/4 smaller because it was 1/4 of the weight. Same thing with dimes. We had silver coins that were worth 1/10 of a dollar. And we had silver coins that were worth 5/100ths of a dollar, so half of a tenth. So dimes and half dimes, what we now know as nickels. And then below that, we had cents or pennies. These were 1/100th of a dollar, and these were coined in copper. That's a little history right there. And actually, all these coins were worth more than they are today. So we actually also had half cents in circulation. And if we had any of these half cents, half a cent won't get you anything. 1 cent won't get you anything. But back then, a half a cent could be used to get you something. That's the power of inflation. And actually, in addition to the silver coins and the copper coins, we had gold coins. These were used for the eagle. The eagle was $10, equivalent to $10. It was smaller in size. That's because gold is way more valuable. It was 17 grams of gold. So this gold coin, it was called the eagle, worth $10. And then we also had the half eagle and then the quarter eagle. These were worth $5 and $2.50. And having the gold standard, anybody could just take their paper certificates, their paper money. They could take it to any Federal Reserve Bank, any specially designated bank, or even to the U.S. Treasury. You could take it there and you could convert or redeem your gold. So whatever value you had in paper currency, you could take it there and you could get your money back in gold. It's like cashing in a check. You know, when you go to the bank, you take in your certificate and boom, you got your money. That's exactly how it worked. And what this did is it prevented the government from having out of control spending, and it prevented banks from having out of control lending, because it forced a sort of financial discipline to where you can give out all the paper currency you want, but you only have a certain amount of gold in the bank to back that. And if people come and they try to claim their gold, and you have all these certificates that you have to claim, and your gold reserves are running dry, it's getting little and little and little, and then until you have none, and then you have a long line of 100 people outside that want their gold, that want to claim their gold, but you don't have any anymore. Well, this is why it was very important to have the gold standard, because it prevented the government from giving out more than they should have, printing out more money than they should have. It's basic fiscal responsibility, financial money matters. You know, you learn this in your basic finance class. Okay. You can't live beyond your means, not for long. Okay. You're gonna dig yourself in a hole of debt, and it's not gonna feel good. It's not a good hole to be in. And if the government was to give out too many, then they would run out and they would lose their trust. Banks would lose their trust. Banks used to have to be responsible. Now they're just bailed out by the FDIC, Federal Reserve. They're just bailed out. They don't learn. And when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, this allowed for a 35% expansion of the money supply over the length of his 5-year presidency. Because for those of you that know a little bit of history, his presidency ended a little bit early when he got impeached, and so his vice president Gerald Ford had to take over. This was known as the Watergate scandal. That's besides the point. But in his 5-year presidency, the money supply expanded by 35%. This has pretty darn effects on the economy. This shot down the value of the dollar relative to gold by 20%. So you expand the money supply, you expand the amount of dollars, which actually dollars were no longer defined by gold. They were now defined by the actual paper. So when you expand the supply of this paper, but you have the same amount of gold, well, it's the paper's going to lose its value compared to that gold, and it did. It lost 20% of its value compared to gold. It went from, you could claim it at $35 an ounce to now $44 an ounce, and you couldn't go and claim it anymore. This was market prices at this point. By the end of his Vice President Ford's 3-year term, gold had hit $160 an ounce. That's an increase of about 357% in the price of gold in 8 years, from the beginning of Nixon's presidency to the end of his Vice President Ford's presidency, and a decrease of 78% of the dollar in relation to gold. Nixon also tried to fight the effects of his policies by imposing wage and price controls that caused surpluses and shortages. There was the emergence of empty shelves, rationing, coupon systems, long lines, and black markets. So there goes the effects of easing monetary and fiscal policies. And now onto FDR, a Democrat president. In order to get us into World War II, and in order to implement his massive New Deal spending, he forcefully confiscated all of our gold, and he even prohibited private ownership of it for a while. They don't teach you that, right? I don't remember learning that. And actually, this suspended the gold standard domestically, and he established Fannie Mae, which is partly why we had the 2008 financial crash. He also started the Social Security program, which is now our nation's second highest expense. Yet, even with this, we see a rising poverty rate among seniors, and the fund is projected to be depleted by the mid-2030s. He also added an annualized rate of 20.6% to the national debt each of the 13 years he was in office. This adds up to a total of 1,022% over the course of his presidency. He took it from 23 billion to 258 billion. He multiplied it by what? 11 times? It wasn't even in the 100 billions. It was in the 20, it was 23 billion up to 258 billion. That's an insane amount of growth. Did a good job. Obama, another Democrat, he took our national debt from around 10 trillion to 20 trillion with his massive welfare spending and lack of taxes to fund that. Trump, a Republican, he also added a lot to the national debt. From the time he took office to the time he left, he added almost $8 trillion to the debt. It grew 40% over the course of his 4 years. This happened because of all his tax cuts without enough spending cuts to accompany them. He also pressured the Federal Reserve to take rates all the way down to zero, something that had never been done before. And this is part of the reason that M1 money supply grew 434% over his presidency, an annualized rate of 52% each year. The dollar lost a third of its value relative to gold, and there's a lot more to go. We also have Ronald Reagan, another Republican. He added more to the debt than Trump and Obama combined on a percentage basis. He added 222%, or 15.7% each year. And he did this by cutting taxes, but at the same time, he doubled the amount that we spent on the military. So that's bound to cause some deficits here and there. And during his presidency, we also saw the supply of M1, which M1, if y'all don't know, it's cash in the economy, and it's deposit checkings accounts. So this is the most liquid form of money. There's also M2, M3, and the higher you go, the more you're getting into savings accounts, retirement accounts, basically, assets, things that aren't as liquid. And so when we look at money supply, we really want to look at all of them, but the main one you look at is M1, and that's what we're talking about. Is just cash and checkings accounts. Well, during his presidency, this almost doubled. It went from $411 billion to $786 billion. LBJ, a Democrat, established his Great Society programs, which included Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty. Medicare and Medicaid, they now amount to the highest spending category for the federal government, taking up about a third of the budget each year. Yeah, they're spending all this money, yet somehow we're seeing obesity rates at a record 42%. This rate has tripled since the 70s. We have a mental health crisis, a 3-year decrease in life expectancy from 2019 to 2021, dramatic increases in drug overdose deaths. In the year 2021, we had 107,000. We have 29 million uninsured Americans, and compared to the rest of the world, we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates among developed countries. We have a rate that's more than double that of other high-income countries. So we're spending all this money, yet it's not doing a great job. He also increased our military's involvement in Vietnam, where 58,000 Americans died. That was a lot of spending there as well. A lot of military spending. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, he was the worst president in terms of percentage increase in debt. He added 2,900% to the national debt. This amounted to an annualized rate of 129% per year. So it more than doubled every year. It's a real crazy trend there. He took it from $90 million to a whopping $2.7 billion, where it wasn't even in the billions before, but he took it there. He took it there. He broke the billions. He broke that 1 billion mark, and then on top of that, doubled it, almost tripled it to 2.7 billion. You know, many people would say that he was justified in this because he did it to end slavery, but that's not actually why he fought the war. He fought it because he wanted to maintain the central government's power over the southern states. This is what the war was mainly about. It was over the issue of states' rights. And then, you know, the North favored a stronger central government, and the South, they didn't want that. They were like, nah, leave me alone. And so Lincoln, he didn't want to let them leave. Why did they want to leave? You know, the issues over the central government had too much power, and one of the things they had too much power on was trade policy. The North liked heavy tariffs, and the South didn't, because the South was reliant on that global trade. You know, they were more of an agricultural-based economy, and so they benefited from this foreign trade more than the North did. They depended on it more. And so when he's putting in these tariffs, what he's doing is he's harming the trade. He's damaging the South's economy. And these southern states, they wanted to separate so that they wouldn't have to have those tariffs. And Abraham Lincoln, he saw this and he said, no, y'all are going to have these tariffs too. Because he didn't want to lose business to the South, where it's cheaper to trade with. If they broke away, they would have taken some business with them, with the rest of the world. And so this was really what the war was about. In his inaugural address in 1861, he stated that he had no intentions of interfering with slavery in states where it already existed. He also endorsed an amendment to the Constitution that would help protect slavery in states where it already existed, just to try to compromise them so that they wouldn't leave. He also avoided threatening certain slave states that were loyal to the Union. He wanted to maintain their support, and so he went easy on them. He didn't want to threaten their slaves. And this was to maintain their loyalty. These were known as the border states. These were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. These states, they were actually exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, which is a document that a lot of people like to point out to, saying how it freed the slaves, but it really just only applied to the Confederate slave states and not any slave states that fought for the Union. And many people don't even know that there were slave states that fought for the Union. And actually, slavery continued in the border states for 2 more years after the Emancipation Proclamation, until the signing and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which effectively did free the slaves. It wasn't really the Emancipation Proclamation. And even after the slaves were freed, it was, these African Americans, they still had a very hard time getting just regular citizen rights. They had to actually add another amendment to make them citizens. So it was all a process. It wasn't really immediate. And in a letter to Horace Greeley, an abolitionist journalist, in 1862, he stated, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. Believe it or not, Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, he was actually kind of opposed to slavery, which might have you thinking, why was he fighting for the Confederacy if he was opposed to slavery? It was because while slavery was one of the issues, it isn't the main issue like people like to say it is. Really, the main issue was the South wanted to secede because it felt like the federal government had too much power over the states and was encroaching on the states' rights. So they thought that the central government, just like the anti-federalists, like Thomas Jefferson, they thought the central government had too much power and that was dangerous. And so they wanted more power delegated to the states. And what the Union thought, what Lincoln thought, was that no, if you want to leave, you can't, because you're part of us, so you're forced to stay. That was really the main idea behind the war. And included in that was trade policy that the South thought was unfair, and how they thought they were regulating it too much. And one of them was slavery, and there was other issues as well. But slavery was not the main issue. And actually, if you look into a lot of Lincoln's speeches, he talks about how he would save the Union even if it means slavery still exists. His main priority was to just keep the Union together. It was not slavery. Now let's get back to our General Robert E. Lee. He got married, and his father-in-law had slaves. And so when his father-in-law died, he inherited his father-in-law's slaves. And this guy, Robert E. Lee, he eventually sells them. Oh, no, he doesn't sell them. He frees them. He releases them because he was opposed to it. Robert E. Lee, the general of the Confederacy, decided that it was apparently only fighting to keep their slaves. He freed his slaves because he didn't agree with having them. And the reason he really fought for the Confederacy was because he was born in Virginia and he didn't want to fight against his fellow Virginians. And not only that, but he felt like the federal government was invading too much with the states' powers and the states' rights. Lincoln, on the other hand, he married Mary Todd, the daughter of Kentucky's largest slaveholder. And so when Lincoln got his father-in-law's slaves, he probably freed them, right? Just like Robert E. Lee did? No, fellas. Abraham Lincoln sold his slaves. He didn't keep them, but he sold them to somebody else to have as slaves. And that's not what Robert E. Lee did. Not only this, but Lincoln was a strong supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act. A strong supporter and a strong enforcer. What was the Fugitive Slave Act? This was the act that made it necessary for the free states to return runaway slaves that they found in the free states, return them back to their slave states, back to where they fled. And in a speech that Lincoln gave criticizing the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, he said, when they, the slave states, he's referring to. When they remind us of their constitutional rights, I acknowledge them, not grudgingly, but fully and fairly. And I would give them any legislation for the reclaiming of their fugitives, which should not, in its stringency, be more likely to carry a free man into slavery than our ordinary criminal laws are to hang an innocent one. He was a strong supporter of the Constitution, apparently, until it came to the First Amendment. He imposed censorship on newspapers that were critical of the government and that spoke against the war. He even arrested 14,000 to 38,000 journalists and individuals and suspended habeas corpus so that they had no fair trials. He just locked them behind bars with no trial. He silenced anybody who spoke against the war. And in the same speech that I just mentioned, he said, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of the new territories. We want them for the homes of free white people." He was talking about the expansion of these new states. He didn't want slavery to be allowed there because he believed that these states should only be reserved for free white people. That's why he didn't want slaves there. He also, referring to the black race, he said, "Free them and make them politically and socially our equals. My own feelings will not admit of this. And if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. Whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. We cannot then make them equals." This is what he said in his speech. Not so much the hero that he's painted to be. He was a two-faced politician that he really only said things to appease the audience that he was speaking in front of, kind of like some people we have today. In a debate with Stephen Douglas in 1958, he stated, "I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, are in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position. I have never said anything to the contrary." This is the true side of Lincoln. He also said that he was not and was never, quote, "in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people." So this was the true side of him. And not only that, the war was just so expensive that Lincoln had to create the IRS and implement the first income tax in the United States. Even with this, the war was too expensive to where he had to issue a paper currency known as greenbacks that were not backed by gold and silver. During the war, the amount of greenbacks in circulation went from 450 million to 1 billion. This caused the inflation rate to reach 80% by the end of the war. Not only was the war expensive in terms of money, but also in terms of lives lost, with about 700,000 soldier deaths and 50,000 to 100,000 civilian deaths. This is a deadly, horrible war that did not have to be waged. Now, enough of Lincoln. Woodrow Wilson a Democrat, he started the Federal Reserve and got us into World War I, another war that I would argue was not necessary for us to get into. But right now, that's not something that we'll get into. He was among the worst in terms of percentage increase to the national debt, with a total increase of 733% over 8 years, or 30.3% each year he was in office. Biden, another Democrat, he's also up there with Obama and Trump in terms of total dollar amount spent, or total dollar amount added to the debt. He also added about 8 trillion, just like Trump. And it's going up when he's still got 2 months left. So we'll see how much more he adds. Bush is not off the hook either. He added $5 trillion in debt, or 89.3% over his presidency. And just like Trump and Reagan, he thought he could cut taxes without any accompanying spending cuts, and actually increased them. He increased spending by 72%. Buchanan, a Democrat, the president right before Abraham Lincoln, he also had an expensive term, adding 233% to the debt, or 35% a year. I could list you more presidents and their mistakes, but we'd be here a lot longer than we'd like. Right now, the federal government is currently spending about $6 trillion a year. This money is going to programs and categories supported by both Democrats and Republicans, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, foreign aid, education, and transportation. The government cannot afford all of this. No matter how nice it is to have, there's one simple truth: we can't afford it. Yet if anyone speaks against any of these programs, they're deemed as not caring for others. When really all of this out of control government spending is what is making life so hard for all of you, for everyone. Republicans used to be able to denounce some of these, but now they're too scared to, because they'll lose their votes. The path of our country that it's been taking is because of decades of irresponsible policies pushed by both Republicans and Democrats. The coming financial crisis is inevitable. We've already pushed the limits of our economy way too far, and something really hard is coming. It can either be released now and will put people in a lot of pain, or it can continue to be kicked down the road and make it worse when it eventually does hit. The Federal Reserve is doing everything in its power to keep kicking the can down the road, and so are the politicians in power. However, the crisis is coming to a point where it can no longer be just simply pushed down the road. The economy is starting to bleed, and Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they'll try to fake a good economy, but they'll only make it 10 times worse. Trump does have some good policies, like cutting back on a lot of regulations that are slowing down the economy, and he did a good job. He cut regulations in his first term, so I want to see if he wins, if he can remove a lot of that red tape that's unnecessary and expensive, and I want to see that. That way we do get more jobs, we do get cheaper prices. I want to see that. But man, Kamala Harris, she's gonna destroy this country. Don't get me wrong, this country is already on the road to destruction, but she's gonna destroy it that much harder, and so will Trump. They're neither of them are good, because neither of them are addressing the main issue that we need to address. Only with that, with Trump, it would be maybe a little bit less painful. But realistically, there's nothing that these candidates can possibly do to stop the pain that's to come. The best thing to do is just to completely get government out of the economy and let it fix itself and have a rapid recovery, which is what we used to let it do. But now the government just always has to get involved. And people are too scared of just letting the economy fix itself. But that's because they don't know that it's fixed itself before. When Warren Harding was president in the 1920s, he stepped back from the economy, and there's a little stock market crash at the beginning of the 1920s, and then the economy corrected itself. But the more you control the economy and the more you mess with the market signals in the economy, the harder boom and bust cycles you're going to have. Our economic policies are like a drug, and we're just addicted to them. This is the real problem that we have, and no matter who wins this election, it's not going to be fixed. A lot of people are saying that Trump's going to stop inflation. No, Trump cannot, and he will not stop inflation. If anything, he's going to make it worse. He's actually the president who pushed down interest rates down to 0%, which before him nobody had done. His deficits also forced the Fed to increase the M1 money supply at an annualized rate of 52% each year, which is more than Obama's 10%. This is highly inflationary monetary policy, and this is how he made the economy look real good when it wasn't. Our debt-based economy is so weak that it relies on real cheap money, real cheap credit, and just so that it looks good, just so that the stock market's doing good, so that it doesn't tank, so that housing prices are maintaining a good investment value. Let's take a step back, however. I want you guys to tell me what the definition of inflation is. Okay, fine, I'll tell you. It's the increase of the cost of living. However, even before this, the definition was an increase in the cost of living as a result of the expansion of the money supply. So that was the full definition. They just took out that second part out. But however, even before this definition, it was different. It was actually the expansion of the money supply itself. Hence the word inflate. You're inflating the money supply. That's why it's called inflation. And what happens as a result of that? Prices go up. So this is why people think inflation means rising prices, when really what it means, it's an inflation of the money supply. And that makes a lot more sense, right? Well, this term actually goes back to when gold and silver were the main forms of money, and paper notes were actually just certificates or claims to that money. And the term inflation began being used during the free banking era, between the 1830s and the 1860s, when banks would issue more banknotes redeemable by gold and silver than they had gold and silver stored in their reserves. And this resulted in the declining value and trust of their banknotes, and resulted in bank runs as well. There was high commodity prices, and the shift of the definition of the word inflation is really one of the reasons why so many people are confused about what exactly inflation is and how it is caused. But if we were just to go back to that simple definition, it would make a lot more sense. And a lot of the things that are happening would finally have an explanation. There are countless examples in history of how an expansion in the money supply caused rapid price increases. There's ancient Rome, medieval China, colonial America, post-revolution US, France in the 1700s, the Spanish dollar in the 18th century. There was the British pound, post-Civil War U.S., because of Lincoln. There was post-World War I, Weimar Republic, which is part of the reason Hitler got so much popularity. Was because he was campaigning on fixing their broken economy. You also see the Turkish lira, the Argentina peso. There's Zimbabwe in recent years, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, Lebanon. There's all these examples, but I'm not going to get into all of them. It's the same pattern every time. The country spends more than it can, and then it monetizes that debt by either printing paper money with an assigned higher value than it really does have, or debasing a metal-based currency. This causes economic struggles that then call for more cheap credit and money, and then the debt snowball gets just too big to control. The only reason the US dollar isn't falling as fast as it should, or as fast as these other currencies did, is because of its status as the world's reserve currency. However, that will soon end. The Federal Reserve is printing more money than it ever has, and it's printing so much that it doesn't even print it. It just changes values digitally on a computer. But why is the Federal Reserve printing so much money? Because it needs to, in order to buy up all of this U.S. government debt that nobody else wants to buy. The U.S. government cannot afford its own budget, therefore it has to go in debt. And foreign lenders are actually starting to sell their bonds because they're realizing that the earnings and interest are just being lost due to the decline in the value of the dollar. So they're making their percentage, but then they're just losing it to inflation. So there's no point. And lenders will stop lending to the U.S. government unless bond yields go up in relation to their price, which is why we see long-term bond yields are going up. It's because people are factoring in the price of inflation, and which, when this happens, it's making our interest problem worse. It's making our interest rate, how much we have to pay on interest, is making it increase that much more. And the Federal Reserve is owning more and more of the total percentage of U.S. bonds because every other lender actually has to give something of value in order to buy those bonds. Whereas the Federal Reserve can just print money or change numbers digitally on a computer and buy bonds with that money. It's virtually zero effort, zero energy. If they want to buy a bond, they can buy a bond. This money then goes to the Treasury, and then from there, it delegates it to wherever Congress decides. Trump, unfortunately, does not have the courage to turn our budget deficits into budget surpluses, and neither does Kamala, but that's what we need to begin paying off our mountain of debt. But nobody's going to do that. No politician has the courage to do it. It's not just Trump and Kamala. It's every politician and us, the voters. Most of the time, we're not in favor of losing our government benefits. We're not in favor of increasing taxes. You know, we're the ones voting for these politicians, so this is why they're too scared to, because we're too scared. But the more that people struggle, the more they're gonna ask for government help, not thinking about the consequences of that help. I also hear a lot of people saying that Trump will bring jobs, and you know, they have a good reason to say this. It's because of all the jobs that he created during his presidency. You know, the first 3 years before all that COVID stuff happened, he created 60 million jobs, and he reduced the unemployment rate from 4.8 to 3.5%, and he brought it down to a 50-year low. And a lot of these statistics were actually benefiting minority groups a lot more. Trump did add a lot of jobs to the economy, but a lot of these jobs were actually a waste of capital, and it was a misallocation of resources. Don't get me wrong, Trump did a lot of good for the economy. He cut back on plenty of regulations, 1,500 to be exact. He slashed taxes that freed up businesses and allowed them to hire more people. However, a lot of these jobs, they only came into existence because he artificially lowered interest rates to 0%. and because he imposed tariffs on foreign goods. What does it mean to artificially lower interest rates? Well, the Federal Reserve can not only expand the supply of money but also the supply of credit. This has a similar effect, might be even more damaging. Not only does the Federal Reserve lend money to the government, but it lends money to the banks. And the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges is known as the discount rate. And the Federal Reserve can also manipulate the interest rate at which banks lend to each other. This rate is known as the federal funds rate. Without a central bank supplying cheap money and credit, banks and the government have to be responsible to make sure they don't go bankrupt. Without the Federal Reserve, banks would have to be more careful about how much money they lend out. Banks would have a limit on how much they could lend out because they kind of have to make sure that they have enough funds available on demand in their vaults for their depositors to withdraw at their convenience, at any moment's notice. If the bank runs out of funds because of irresponsibly lending out more than they should have, then there'll be a panic, and people will run to the bank and try to take their money out. This is known as a bank run. And back then, bank runs would happen when banks would lend out more than they should have. Now this doesn't really happen anymore because the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, comes to the rescue. Even if banks are being irresponsible with their lending decisions, it's like a child not learning to be financially responsible because their parents just spoil them all the time. Or when kids are making bad decisions and their parents just decide to reward them. That's what the Federal Reserve is doing with our banks. But without a central bank to come to the rescue, banks have to make sure that they're lending to the right people. What does this mean? They have to lend to borrowers that are more than likely to pay the funds back with the added interest. This means that back then there's a lot more lending for businesses than there was for consumption purposes. Business loans are what leads to economic growth. When businesses grow, this leads to a more competitive job market, which means more jobs and higher paying ones at that. It also leads to competitive goods, which, this means higher quality at a cheaper price. However, when there's a central bank artificially expanding the supply of money and credit, banks can just lend to anybody without worrying so much if they can pay it back. This means that when borrowers fail to pay back their loans, which has happened multiple times, like the 2008 financial crisis, for example, the Federal Reserve has to come in and bail these banks out and print more money to do so. Accompanied with that is more government programs adding to the total government spending, which leads to higher deficits in order to ease the effects of the crash, therefore building up to an even bigger bubble years later. So this prompts a question: what's the right interest rate? Well, just like with anything in the economy, the right price is always dictated by supply and demand. Why is this the case? Well, when a good is high in demand and low in supply, it's going to have a very, very high price. This is the market telling us that we need more of this good, and so it makes it more lucrative to produce. You get bigger profits. However, if something is low in demand and high in supply, it's going to have a pretty low price. This low price stirs away investment because we already have enough of it, and any more would be a waste of resources that could be used elsewhere. Government likes to mess with these market signals and set price controls that are actually different from what the market sets based on supply and demand. If government sets a lid on gas at $2 because the government says that it's not as available as it should be, and because it wants to help people afford gas, what it does is it artificially increases demand and decreases supply. More people are going to try to buy gas at this lower price, but there's going to be less businesses that think it's worth it to produce, and it makes it so that it's not worth it anymore. And this creates an imbalance between supply and demand. There's more people that want gas, but less businesses producing that gas. And in trying to increase accessibility, the government really just did the opposite. Sometimes instead of setting a lid on prices, the government will set a minimum on prices. For example, let's take the minimum wage. Let's say it moves to $20 an hour. This creates an imbalance. There will be an increase in the supply of workers looking for a $20 an hour job, and many of these are unskilled teenagers who haven't had their first job. However, employees don't think these teenagers are worth the $20 because they don't have any job experience. And these businesses, they're paying more on labor now, and so they get more selective with who they hire. And they start looking for 2 years of experience. When how are you supposed to get experience if every job that you apply to is a $20 an hour job looking for 2 years of experience? And this is what happens. It creates an unemployment problem. The government creates a surplus of workers that are looking for a job but can't get one. And actually, now the big companies like Walmart and Amazon, aka the same ones lobbying for these types of policies, they decide to invest in robots so that they no longer have to hire expensive employees. This results in layoffs, and smaller businesses are just left to struggle as they can't afford the robots nor the employees. And what does this do? This creates less competition in the market. So now these bigger companies, they feel more comfortable jacking up their prices and not having as good quality. This is a policy with good intentions that actually worsens the economy. And what are we seeing a lot of right now? We're seeing mass layoffs. UPS, Amazon, Bank of America, all price controls misallocate resources in the economy. And lending is no different. The supply of these loans is the amount of savings being held in these banks, and the demand is the amount that people in the economy want to borrow. If a bank sets an interest rate that's too low, lenders will flood the bank and run the bank dry of its reserves, leaving the other borrowers that could have paid those interest rates with no funds. When the banks set an interest rate that's too high, there's a pool of savings that could be used by businesses but isn't being used because it's too expensive. The bank is losing on potential profits, and we're losing on potential innovation in the market. In a scenario with no central bank manipulating the economy, there must first be savings before there is lending. And right now, what do you see? Record low savings and record high debt. And this is because of our artificially low interest rates. When you take away that control, you don't get statistics like this. The artificially low interest rate causes artificial booms in the economy, and then it's followed by busts. Central banks are what cause a boom and bust cycle. Artificially low rates allow for investment in the wrong parts of the economy, which presents itself as a boom. The bust that follows is the economy trying to fix itself. This is part of the reason the stock market did so well under Trump. Cheap money and credit flooded these assets, which is why we now have the highest price to earnings ratio than ever. The prices of stocks have skyrocketed, even though the actual value, the earnings, haven't quite as followed. The stock market has become one of short-term speculation rather than long-term investment in the value of the company. And what does this mean? People now only buy stocks so that they can sell them at a higher price. It relies on the greater fool theory, whereas before people bought stocks in order to earn dividends from the country. Not from the country, the company. This is why the stock market is bullish when the Federal Reserve cuts rates and is bearish when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates. It's all dependent on debt. Same thing for the housing market. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they were giving mortgages to people who weren't able to pay them off, but this caused an artificial increase in the demand for houses. And this is what caused the boom in the price. However, these people couldn't afford to pay their houses anymore. So they were forced to sell their homes, and this was the crash. This artificial boom in the housing industry caused an artificial increase in the amount of jobs in the industry as well. And then when the crash happened, these jobs were lost. All the jobs created from artificially low interest rates will inevitably be lost. How do we create more jobs that won't be lost as a result of the boom and bust cycle? Well, we have to create strict lending so that banks are forced to only lend to those who will pay back the loan. These borrowers are the businesses who have real long-term value with valuable jobs that will not be lost. Having interest rates artificially low ruins this dynamic. So, what has Trump proposed in his plan to rescue our economy? He has proposed 100% tariffs on countries that want to ditch the dollar, 10% credit card interest rate cap, and various tax cuts. These tariffs are intended to increase the amount of manufacturing jobs here in the US, but they're the last thing that American consumers need. The reason we lost our manufacturing industry is because of excessive taxes and regulation that made it pointless for these manufacturing companies to do business here. And so they all left. If we want to bring back this industry, deregulation is what we need. Adding these tariffs, raising the prices of our foreign competition will only make the average American's life so much harder. We're lucky that other countries are still selling their goods to us. Imports are starting to get more expensive because of the decrease in global demand for the dollar. Why is there a decrease in the global demand for the dollar? Well, first, the US dollar is no longer backed by gold or anything real. The reason the US dollar became the world reserve currency in the first place is because it was the only currency tied to gold during the time of World War II, when every major country was going through these deficits for the war, and they had to abandon their versions of the currency in order to fund the war. But the US was the only one that hadn't done that. Well, they did it during FDR, but only domestically. They still had a foreign gold standard. And so all these countries around the world, it was known as the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. All these countries met up and they tied their currencies to the dollar, making the dollar the world reserve currency. However, all these central banks are now ditching their dollars and replacing them with gold. Not only was the dollar backed by gold, but it was backed by real goods that were produced here in the US. We used to be the world's biggest manufacturer and exporter, and we used to produce half of the world's manufactured goods by the end of World War II. We ran trade surpluses of 12 billion. Today, we're seeing trade deficits of 948 billion. Not only that, but in 1971, Nixon, he took us off the gold standard, and he made it so that US dollars were no longer redeemable by gold. And this caused a big wave of inflation and rising prices in the 70s. The dollar is no longer backed by anything but trust and convenience, and when the government keeps abusing that trust by taking $10 billion in circulation in 1941 to 2.3 trillion in 2022, well, the dollar starts losing its value and countries move to other currencies. And so when we impose 100% tariffs on the dollar, on the countries that want to ditch the dollar, all we're doing is adding to the list of reasons to ditch the dollar, making it happen faster. This is pretty scary. Well, most of what we buy comes from China. These types of tariffs could result in prices doubling all across the board, adding to the existing pain of Americans. Let's talk about that 10% interest rate cap that Trump wants to place on credit cards. He wants to do this because he wants to make a hard situation a little bit easier for the average American, not realizing that a cap like this would result in Americans losing their access to credit cards. If he was to impose this cap, none of these credit card companies would give out any more credit cards. The reason they're charging such high interest rates is because this is the riskiest form of lending. And they have the highest rate of people not paying back, and so they have to raise their rates to make up for that loss. That's how credit cards work. And this policy will not make much of a difference though, because most Americans have their credit cards all maxed out anyway, and you can't really get access to more after that. It's not too easy. But if he does this, then it's just going to cut our access to credit cards for good. Both Trump and Kamala are trying to appease to the voters that are struggling with today's economy, but they're doing so with policies that will hurt us more in the long run and brought us that pain in the first place. Harris's policies, they're just as bad, but they're actually a lot more invasive to the rights of Americans. I'd say hers are a little bit scarier. She wants to ban price gouging, which essentially she's blaming the effects of reckless fiscal and monetary policies on businesses, and she wants to impose price controls on them as a result. This, as we went through earlier, it'll lead to a shortage of goods that we need. And along with that, she's coming in with more forms of government help that she probably has not thought about where the money for that is going to come from. And all this government help, you can make all the promises in the world, but if the production isn't there, then it means nothing. You can print out a lot of dollars. You can spend all this money on welfare, but if at the end of the day it's just gonna increase prices all across the board and it's gonna make people's situation worse, then it's not worth it. It's like a pie. Oh, how about this? Look, y'all remember getting pizza parties in school, and the teacher bought one pizza box. There was 20-something students in the class, and so the teacher cut a slice for every student. And so it turns out all these slices were not slices, they were slits. Each slice was super, super thin. But that's because the teacher created more slices with the same amount of pizza. This is exactly what the government does when they hand out money. They're handing out claims to the goods and services of the economy, but they're not producing more goods and services in the economy. And lastly, she also proposed a tax on unrealized gains, and this is something super scary, which is when you have an asset that goes up in value, the government will be able to classify that difference in value as income, and they'll be able to tax you on it, even if you haven't sold it. I see it as an outright abuse of power and a complete invasion of privacy. Your property is not really your property anymore. And I see so many ways for them to abuse this. Because what do they have to do? Same way they made the stock market go up, they make your stocks go up, and then you haven't sold anything, and they see that the equity on that went up 50%, they'll be able to take part of that return. Even if the true value of the stock didn't go up, it just went up in terms of the currency, because the currency is being devalued. And that's why there's such a big difference when you measure our stock market in terms of dollars than when you measure it in terms of ounces of gold. You'll see that there's not actually that much growth in the stock market like they say it is. But that's because it's all masked away by inflation. Same thing with GDP. There could be all this spending in the economy, all this spending. But at the end of the day, if the supply, the production isn't actually there, it doesn't matter how much you spend. The spending is just a number. What people want is not the number. What people want is what you get with that number. And so, yeah, we see that no candidate is fit to save us. However, there is still hope. It's never the end of the world. One of the most important things is through these tough times, we all need to stick together and listen to each other and help each other out. And that's why I really think it's super important for us to, now more than ever, stay close to God. Because there's only one person that can save America. There's only one being that can save America, and that is God. He's the only being that can save all of humanity. And he has the power to do anything. And so no matter what type of financial situation you're in, or what type of political situation, having faith that God is by your side is what saves you from a life of anxiety, pain, and stress, and suffering, and anything it is that's bad for you. Being close to Him, it makes you realize that there's more to life than what's going on in the physical world. And when you're close to Him, it builds your spirit, and it makes you capable of taking on life's problems. And it makes you a stronger person, a happier person. It makes you a servant to the greater good, to the community. It makes you that light that the world needs. No materialistic gain will make you permanently happy, and no materialistic loss will make you permanently unhappy. And actually, it could be argued that too many materialistic gains make it harder for you to be happy, and it makes it harder to have spiritual gains. What gives you long-term happiness in reality is a strong relationship with God. Because God loves you and He knows what's best for you. And it's important to have not only a strong relationship with Him, but a strong relationship with your community, a strong relationship with yourself, and a strong relationship with the environment. Love your neighbor. Just be a person of love. And with Him, anything is possible. And you'll realize that all of the problems in your life are actually so small and meaningless that it really all is just a test of your faith in Him. And when you put your life in the hands of God, you just become happier than ever and wiser than ever. And so no matter what happens, just remember to always keep your relationship with God at the forefront of your life. And with this, doesn't matter what type of economic storm is headed your way, what type of political corruption is going on. None of that matters, because at the end of the day, this world is temporary. Yeah, so that's the good part about all of this, is that He's up there, He's waiting for you. One day we're all gonna die, and we'll live a long, eternal, spiritual life of fulfillment. All right. Well, I'll see y'all there.